Hugh Lunn has had an extraordinary career as a journalist and writer. From humble beginnings as a cadet journalist with the Courier-Mail in Brisbane, Lunn spent 7 years overseas working in the UK, Singapore, Russia and China. He also covered the Vietnam War and the Act of Free Choice in West Papua with Reuters. He returned to Australia and was the editor of The Australian in Brisbane. In the course of his career, Lunn claimed 3 Walkley Awards, one of the highest honours for a journalist in Australia, in the years 1974, 1975 and 1979. Lunn is also the author of several famous books, including Vietnam, A Reporter's War and Over the Top with Jim. Lunn has also published 2 biographies, including his most recent published work, The Great Fletch, on the life of tennis champion and close friend Ken Fletcher. Lunn has also been honoured as one of Queensland's most influential artists in the recent Q150 Anniversary Awards. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Hugh Lunn. Hugh, thank you very much for joining me.
Good on you, Nick.
Hugh, one of the most influential artists in Queensland, being a passionate Queenslander, you must be delighted with that award.
Yeah, well, it's always nice to get something like that. I was pleasantly surprised, let's put it that way.
Hugh, who has influenced you as a writer, and who do you admire working locally and abroad?
Well, I suppose I was mainly influenced by a lot of famous journalists, really. In Vietnam, for example, almost all the famous American writers had to send their copy, their stories to America via our office, via the telex, and I used to stand there reading it. And one of the things I picked up from them is that the best writer writes what he sees, not what he's told. And that was a good lesson I learnt from them.
Do you think there's issues of objectivity and sensationalism that are pertinent in journalism at the moment?
Well, journalism has become more and more opinionated, and I suppose I can't complain about that. I probably helped start it. But, you know, it's mainly...
It was one of the things you were criticised for, wasn't it?
It was, that's right. And I laugh
days.
now because I read The Barefoot Investor the other day, and he had I, my, mine, me in the first sentence. And, well, yeah, well, people criticised me for saying, you know, I think Joe's going to win the election, or I think Joe's going to lose the election. And they wrote, you know, who the hell cares what Hugh Lunn? And they said that they filed the I off my typewriter, which actually, unless they did the wrong typewriter, never happened. But what I'd learnt from watching the Americans in Vietnam, for example, the LA Times had a bloke who was about 60 who worked out of our office and sat there writing his stories, and he was always sitting there thinking. And Bill Toohey, his name was, and you know, everyone was saying they were losing the war, but he was never saying they were losing the war. But finally, just around the Tet Offensive time, he said the American military says that they see the big picture and the reporters only see little pinpricks. And he said, well, I now say the big picture is dangerously out of focus. And this had a huge impact in America because he said what he thought for the first time. And so if ever I thought I needed to say what I thought, I did.
Hugh, when did you make the choice? Because obviously you went into a cadetship at the Courier-Mail straight out of school. You were, by your own admission, not the world's greatest student, but you,
that's true.
You did have some people who believed in you back in senior, and Brother Campbell was one of those, the headmaster of Terrace and your English teacher. How important was an influence like that in terms of steering you in the course that you ultimately went in?
Well, if it hadn't been for Sister James, for example, there was a really old nun, I wouldn't have got past state scholarship to secondary school, which you had to pass to go to secondary school. And she pinned the medal of St Jude, the patron saint of hopeless causes, to my collar and gave me her fountain pen and said, no one who has ever used this pen has failed state scholarship. And so we had to go to the state school, which was the home of our natural enemies in those days, and so I went and used that pen. And I got through by 1 mark. I got 76 out of 150 for English. And then I would never have passed senior and got to university. You know, as Brother Campbell, Doc, used to say, if you don't pass English, you won't get to look through the paling fence at the university. And you know, and we had the A class and the Bs and the Cs, and I was in the Cs, and he came down and said, I'm here to tell you that there is no disgrace in being even the least when all are great. and he gave you the confidence, and he made us learn 4 lines of poetry every night off by heart. And education departments now are against what they call rote learning. We called it by heart. But I think it's a wonderful thing, because I think the greatest thing that has aided me as a writer has been all that poetry which I've carried around in my mind ever since. And you know, I can still quote most famous poets from hundreds of years ago. And it teaches you that words have weight as well as meaning.
Yeah. Hugh, in terms of defining yourself as a writer, do you see yourself as a reporter, an observer, a storyteller? I know you're all 3 of those, but is there...
Yeah. Well, it annoys me a bit that a lot of people come up and say, oh, you're a yarn spinner. Particularly, you know, there's this idea that if you write fiction, then you're in the literary world, and if you write non-fiction, you're not in the literary world. But I don't think that's true. In fact, many fictional stories, you know, often things turn out to be the opposite of the reality, and many fiction stories are in fact totally true, but non-fiction, because of the law, can never be totally true. And so in a way, non-fiction can be more creative than fiction. So I don't see myself as a yarn spinner.
Hugh, one of the things that really stands out in your works is magnetic characters. Do you see yourself as a character writer? Explain the process for us in terms of when you sit down to write something. Is it really the personality of the character that brings you in first?
Well, I think the basis of my books are the interesting characters I write about, because I always used to say when I was a feature writer that the best way to write a story is through a person. And you know, I remember they wanted a story on, back in the 70s, the cattle industry was going bad and the sheep industry was going bad and the wheat industry, and they sent a reporter to each, and the others wrote about how the wheat industry, so many million tonnes, so much a pound. And I went and just drove into any cattle property north of Rockhampton, and the bloke was there, and I introduced myself and met his wife and kids, and I stayed the night with them because I wanted to see what it was like. And so I wrote a story about the bloke who washes his hair with Solvol soap, you know, that sandpaper soap, and about how tough he was without even knowing it, you know. And when I went to get a biscuit, a redback spider rolled out in front of me, and I leapt up in the air, and he leaned across and stubbed it out with his finger. And so I just observed him. And I wrote about the struggle he had living in a tin shed, you know, and I said where it looked as if Myers and Japan had been excluded from their lives. So what I try to do, and I think that always makes a better story. And so, you know, with Jim Egoroth, you know, Over the Top with Jim, part of capturing a person is that I think everyone has their own way of speaking. So, you know, Jim would always say to me, "G'day, Lon, how you been going these couple of last days?" And he still does today. Or he would arrive at my place and it's pouring rain, and he'd say, "It's raining dingoes out there," whereas we'd say cats and dogs. And he'd say, "What do you think it is, a bush Christmas?" And so he mixed up all our Australian sayings. And this, you know, when I said, "Who gave you that black eye, Jim?" He said, "Nobody gave it to me, I had to fight for it." So I was able to capture. You need a characteristic in their speech so the person knows who's talking.
You're passionate about language. You've actually written a book about
Australia's
language.
lost language, yes.
And are we losing it? Are we losing a big part of what's characterised our speech for so long?
Well, I would say it's gone, really. In the book, Lost for Words, I said, you know, I'm asking for it back because we had this euphonious, smart Aussie language, which has been replaced by American TV sitcom language. And the trouble with TV sitcom language, it's very good for saying things in a hurry, but it's very aggressive and dismissive. So if I said to you, "Get real, get over it, tell someone who cares, whatever, in your dreams." But this is, you know, language comes from the world around you. Parents often gave children mystical answers which didn't mean anything. It's a wing wong for a goose's bridle. If you put it on backwards, it would fit an elephant. So
It's wonderfully poetic.
Yeah, that's right, and it is poetic.
Yeah.
And that's what I liked about them.
Yeah. It's a wonderful project. It's really preserving it in much the same way that your books have preserved as a time capsule a period of the 1950s in Australia, which was a pretty unique time.
Well, that's what I found was that when I wrote Over the Top with Jim, publishers had told me they didn't want a book on my childhood. And they said books on childhood are boring. And that was good they told me that, because I thought, well, people must be falling down in some area. And I thought, I've got to capture everybody's childhood. That's where we're falling down. And so when I was doing it, I thought, how can I capture everybody's childhood? So I made a list of what Australia was like, and we listened to wireless serials on the wireless, and we spoke differently. And so, you know, I had my mother saying, when a woman came into the shop all dolled up to the nines, she'd lean over to me and say, "What you see when you haven't got a gun?" Or if she had a lot of feathers, they wore wax fruit or feathers. She'd say, if she had another feather, she'd fly. And my father, if he's going for a beer, he'd say, "I'm off to see a man about a dog." If he's going to the SP bookie, he'd say, "I'm off to see the wizard." And so I used these in the book. And you didn't fall over, you had a buster, or you came a gutser, or you came a cropper. So I used these in the book, and I got letters from all over Australia, every state in Australia, saying, "That's how my parents spoke." And that's when I realised that everyone in Australia calls someone who whinged a misery guts. So I started writing them down to do the book, and I did it for 16 years till I had enough.
We were talking before about you being an influential artist. The other thing that Over the Top with Jim achieved, I suppose, is that a lot of other people came out and started writing their memoirs and their books. Are you proud of that?
Well, I'm glad you noticed that, Nick. Well, the book publishing industry has theories. You know, green book covers don't sell, and Australian childhoods didn't sell was one of their tenets that they lived by. And because Over the Top with Jim sold such a mozza, and still, you know, people in the book industry say books have the shelf life of yogurt, but Over the Top with Jim is, you can walk into a bookshop today and buy it, and it's 20 years this year since it came out. And so after it was so successful, they rang up lots of journalists to ask them to write a book about their childhood, and many were published.
How hard was it to get yourself in the voice for that book? Because you wrote it from a child's perspective, obviously.
Yeah, well, I think that was, you know, Doc Campbell used to tell us that if you don't have three things in your writing, it's just doggerel. He said you've got to have humour, dignity, and inspiration. And so I thought I'd be able to do the humour all right, and I thought, well, I'll try and keep it dignified, but the inspiration was the thing. And so I resigned from working for Rupert after 17 years to write that book, and I sat at home for 9 months before I wrote a word, thinking, how am I going to do this? How am I going to start? And the inspiration was to write it from the point of view of the child, to start with, because you've got to get the reader in on the first page, and they're not going to keep reading. So, you know, so I didn't know much about what was going on in the world when I was 9 years old, but I knew you didn't get Russians called James. and in my list I had, we were frightened of the Russians, scared of communism, had the White Australia policy, everyone 13 had to have a 303 rifle. And so Dmitry Egorov, or Jim, was the perfect vehicle. He arrived and his name was James in the book, and I thought, he's not and so I called him a Russian communist pig and a Russian dog, and to my surprise he swung around and said, "You Australian donkey, I rub your ears." And he nearly rubbed my ears off. And so that's how I started the book, and I could maintain that theme then about the atomic bomb, could blow up the whole of Annerley Junction, and brought all those things back to the local level. Like in my book on being in Red China, I often bring it back to Brisbane.
Hugh Lunn, it's been wonderful talking to you. Thanks so much for being here, and we look
Nick.
forward to talking to you again at the round table a little later.
Okay,
Thanks,
good.
Hugh.
Oh.